Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind. In the heart of the wilderness, massive handprints leave an impression on the minds of the boys who discovered them. Their origin remains shrouded in secrecy, leaving behind a trail of intrigue and endless speculation. Join Cameron Buckner as he reads The Bigfoot's Handprints.
I grew up at a time when there were lots of wild spaces, unused areas that maybe 4 or 5 adults would venture into over the course of a year. Possibly local government folks or state or federal environmental professionals, maybe a rancher or farmer or fisherman or a hunter, but by and large these areas saw few humans. If you are from that era, you know exactly what I mean. In many ways, at least for kids and teens, it was a simpler time even though there were wars going on. The civil rights movement was beginning to grow full steam. There were riots and the sort of mayhem that we still see on TV and phones today. But being country kids without social media permeating every aspect of our lives, we were essentially free from much of society's troubles and free just to be kids. This place is in the far Midwest. Some would call it the near West. I grew up here in a small town and had many friends whose parents owned farms or ranches. This was a time when even as 8 to 12-year-olds, we would ride our bikes miles and miles from home to places that were interesting in our young minds, and we had no fear of anything bad happening to us. In fact, most of our parents would think we were sick or ill if we were hanging out inside the house for more than an hour or two, even when the weather was bad. We were always out and about, and we would explore, build forts, play hide and seek, as well as fish and eventually hunt together in these locations. One place in particular that was a favorite because it backed up against my friends Terry and Dale's ranch was on Blueberry Lane. Blueberry Lane was about 3.5 miles long and teed off the local county highway. Blueberry Lane crossed Silver Creek at about the 2-mile mark, and it extended for another mile before dead-ending in a mix of pine and post oak and open grassland, and that eventually led into another large ranch and state and federal land that was all forested. Near the county highway and the first mile of Blueberry Lane, my friends' folks would pasture cattle and had a few alfalfa fields on their ranch. But for the most part, it was open grassland and large pines and oaks. Along Silver Creek was a gallery forest of trembling aspen, some large old gnarled pines, some box elder, volunteered mulberry trees, elderberry bushes, wild roses, occasionally wild crab apples, and thorn apples. The brush was thick unless they would run cattle in there from time to time, and it would get knocked down. Again, this was a place when there were still lots of open spaces, lonely, unused areas that for kids our age was absolutely paradise. Where Blueberry Lane crossed Silver Creek, there was an old cement bridge with no side railing. We called it Hodges Bridge, and that spanned the 40-foot creek. I don't know why it was called Hodges Bridge. It was just part of the local lore, I guess. That's what we called it, and all the kids knew exactly what we were talking about when we spoke of it. I think it was built during the CCC days, for those in your audience who actually know what that was. There was also an old stream gauging station in a 12 by 15 foot building with white clapboard siding and no windows sitting next to the creek. It was on a poured concrete subwall that was exposed on the creek side. There was also an old outhouse with a 4-pane French window on the creek side. We always thought it was funny. It was a loo with a view. The county or some agency would come out and mow around the small lawn there once or twice a year to keep the brush down, but like I said, almost no adults would ever be seen there. The old outhouse was always a haven for yellow jackets and snakes, so we gave that a wide berth. I don't ever remember using it. We would visit this place pretty regularly in the years between my 8th and 14th birthday, mostly in spring and summer when the creek was really rolling from the snowmelt or the storms. We would take our BB and pellet guns and eventually 22s to plink and target shoot, and then shotguns down there in later years to hunt grouse in the fall. There were huge roosts of cliff swallows under the bridge too, and I swear that is where my interest in birds and my eventual career choice was made at a young age. There was also a huge sandy cut bank with a National Geographic worthy bank swallow colony in it. All that is now gone from floods, but oh, what magic there was during those formative years. What was odd, and I didn't realize it until years later, was the stream gauging building. I think it was the second time we had ventured down there. We had ridden up to the bridge on our bikes, intently focusing on the water and the birds, the frogs, fish, etc., when Dale said, "Would you look at that?" We hardly paid any attention, but he persisted, and we all looked up. On the side of the building facing us were huge muddy handprints. At the time, we joked that they had been made by a giant and they were all around the building. They were at least 12 inches long from the heel of the hand to the fingertips. We speculated that it was some older kids or high schoolers doing some initiation or playing games and did not give it another thought. To play along, we went down every time we were there and got muddy hands and put our own signature on the white clapboard siding and the exposed cement. We never really paid that much attention to it, but over the preceding 6 or so years into my adolescence, there would be fresher prints and we would draw the outlines of large hands with mud, including continuing to place our own hand-size marks on the building. It became a ritual for us, and that is how the place became known as the Hand House. I became a teenager, and we rarely ventured there again, occasionally for beer parties at night, but we never saw or heard anything, at least nothing that we thought was scary or to be concerned about. We were just bucolic kids being bucolic kids doing what kids do in that country. We also hunted and fished that entire area, and I don't remember ever feeling like I was being watched or saw anything like many people describe, just deer and the occasional bear and other wildlife. But the last time I was there during those years, I was 18, and there were new handprints on the building. Roll forward 45 years, and I had gone on to become an environmental professional and worked around the country and, in fact, around the world in my early government career and then consulting business. I had come full circle and was now working the last few years of my career for an agency in my home county. It was 2003, and amazingly, I had an assignment to go out on Blueberry Lane to the old gauging station. There was a request to inspect it and possibly do restoration on the building. It was still functional, but it had been retrofitted many years earlier, and they wanted some newer equipment installed and wanted to know if the building was still sound. So there I was with a young novice, we'll call him Brad, at my side going out to look at the old place. I regaled Brad with my childhood stories and told him about the Hand House and how it got its name. He eyed me cautiously, thinking I was laying out a tall tale on him. I finally got to go inside the small building after all this time and was amazed how well it had survived the years. The timber was still sound, and they had redone the roof about 15 years earlier, but on balance, the old real 8/4 2x6 studs were in great shape, and there were little signs of aging. And to my surprise, even the old outhouse was still standing and still had yellow jackets and snakes, but had been partially grown over with Virginia creeper, wild grapes, and wild roses. They had put a new door on it at some point, and the 4-pane French windows had somehow survived our rock throwing and BB guns and the generations of kids that had surely come after us. And Brad asked, "So did you ever use this?" pointing at the outhouse. I said, "Hell no, too many yellow jackets and snakes." He chuckled and decided to go use the bushes. I walked around the building and looked at it, trying to see if there were any remnants of recent handprints on the old paint, but I saw none. The paint on the outside of the building had started to peel, so we got a local paint guy to come out with a small crew and strip it, treat it, prime it, and repaint it in 3 days. It looked brand new for an 80-plus-year-old building. The day it had been painted, Brad decided that he'd like to stay out there for the night after hearing all the stories. And it was, well, peaceful, magical in some ways to my old nostalgic mind. It sort of looked the same. The bridge was still there, and the creek channel had shifted a few times, at some point taking that sandbank where all the bank swallows were. The trees had changed a little, with some dying and falling over into the creek, as well as the shrubs being thicker in places. There were a few more houses and people out that way now, but my friend Dale had since taken over the ranch, and his brother Terry had gone on to work in the movie industry. Their ranch was still the same. The area had been changed some, but was still a lot like it was when we were kids. There was more trash, sadly. We never left stuff out there even as young kids. At worst, we would burn our candy and gum wrappers and potato chip bags or our bait cartons. We never left the glass pop bottles, eventually beer, out there. We always took that stuff back home. Why trash a place where you like to be? Anyway, I went home that night and I told Brad I'd be out early about 5:30 a.m. that next morning to pick him up, and I'd bring my fly rod too. We would see if we could put a limit of rainbows and brookies before we got on the clock. He had brought a sleeping bag and some extra sandwiches and water for his evening meal, and I told him some good places to go to try fishing, as he'd also brought his fly rod after seeing some good-sized trout the previous 2 days. And then I left, and I wished him a good evening. I rolled out of bed at 4:30 a.m. the next morning. It was a half-hour drive to Blueberry Lane. I turned down the lane in the early dim light and had my window down, listening to the birds sing their morning sonnets. I got about a half-mile down the road, and even in the dim light, I could see a figure running down the road towards me. As I got closer, it was Brad. He was in his cross trainers and shorts and no shirt. He was wild-eyed and stuttering. He kept yelling, "Get me out of here! Get me out of here! They came back, man! They came back!" I poured him some coffee from my thermos and turned on the heater in the truck. He was a complete mess. I said, "Calm down, kid. What are you talking about? Who came back? Were there people down there bucking you last night?" I started to get mad. It seemed like a symptom of our society today. People, Brad said. "Yeah, if you want to call them people, I'd call them effing monsters, man. They were huge, hairy effing monsters. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever, man. They were huge and pissed." I could not understand what the kid was talking about. This had to be a prank. I said, "Are you okay with driving back down there? I want to see what happened. I've got my .45 right here under the seat if we have any trouble." And he instantly fired back, "Is it loaded?" I looked at him and said, "Yes, what good is a gun if it isn't loaded?" And he said, "Okay, but I don't want to hang there, man. And if you don't mind, I'm staying in the truck." I said, "Okay," wondering what this kid had been smoking. I then proceeded to slowly drive, almost creak, down to the hand house and let him unload whatever was eating him. Over the next 5 minutes, Brad relayed what had happened. He said he heard noises and then grunting and growling outside the building at about 2:30 a.m. He just thought it was a bear or maybe even some cows. He had slept with the door closed to keep out the bugs, and then at about 3:30 a.m. it all started. Rustling, heavy breathing, and chatter, and then hard slaps on the outside of the building. This continued periodically for an hour or more until he couldn't take it any longer. He decided to go out and confront whoever this was. He said he started yelling at the people from inside the building and then ran outside with his flashlight. He said that he heard crashing in the brush and woods and then saw an immense figure about 20 yards away walking across the bridge in the dim moonlight. He yelled again, and it growled or yelled back at him, and then it threw a stone in his direction. He heard another one closer, and in his panic state, he said it seemed as if he would get cut off from the hand house. He had one option, the outhouse. He fled into the outhouse and slammed the door. Within seconds, he heard them outside, and they started banging on the outhouse and shaking it, growling and chattering. He was in there for maybe 10 minutes and then made the mistake of looking up at the French-paned window. Staring back at him was a monster, its breath briefly fogging the glass as it exhaled. He said he remembered things fading to black and falling and thinks he passed out from fear. In his total panic, he did not realize the shaking had disrupted the Yellow Jackets, and they had begun to attack him and woke him up by stinging him. It gets cold here even in the summer, so they were not fully charged, but they had done some damage. He came to and bolted out of the outhouse screaming at the top of his lungs and had run up Blueberry Lane in his shorts where I had met him. Now, in the early light, I could see the swollen stings on his face and his back and his legs, probably 30 or more angry, red, growing welts. He was a mess. As I pulled up to the hand house, I rolled down my window to listen. I heard nothing. Brad said, "Please close the windows, man. Just grab my stuff and let's get out of here. I don't want to be here, man. You got that?" And then uttered a lengthy string of colorful metaphors. I rolled up the window and got out with my pistol, and then I walked 2 steps and I stopped. My mouth dropped. There was the hand house covered in large 12 to 14-inch muddy handprints, just as I had seen it over 40 years earlier. I slowly walked around the building, and it was truly covered. There were kids, pranksters, Bigfoot, whatever, claiming the newly painted building, like tagging it with graffiti. Were they mad at Brad for staying the night? I didn't even believe in these things, and here the evidence was again staring me in the face. I took Brad's things to the truck, and he said, "Let's go." I said, "Hang on for a second." I was curious now, and I walked back out onto the bridge. I had been in this place over 200 times in my youth and only saw the handprints and never thought for a second something larger than life had created them. I stood there for probably 5 minutes, and I could hear Brad demanding that we leave. The water was making its usual sounds. The birds were doing their early morning calls. It was by all accounts another gorgeous morning. Nothing seemed abnormal. I took 1 step back towards the truck, and I heard a guttural growl over the sound of the creek on the far side. I stopped. I turned back, and then one of the most hair-raising howls, screams, whatever you want to call it, I have ever heard in my life, blasted from the same area. It literally shook me with its force. Brad went absolutely nuts. I thought he was going to jump out and start running again. I turned, and I was in the truck and spinning the tires so fast I don't even remember running. I drove up Blueberry Lane without saying a word, my own mind spinning and trying to get my head around what had just happened. We returned to the office, and Brad asked me to drive him over to his apartment. I said nothing, and I drove him there, and then I said, "I'll see you back at work." He just gave me an odd blank look. I went to the local diner and had a good cup of coffee and tried to logically think through the events of the day. That was not a prankster, and it was not a recording. I've done a bunch of playback recordings in my work, and there's always a fake quality and bleed to the audio. Was it a Bigfoot? As a professional biologist, I'm not sure what to say. What else has a hand that size with an opposable thumb it would make a noise that loud? I have never seen one of these creatures. I've talked to 2 people, not including Brad, who have. They seem credible. One was another professional biologist. I drove back to the office and opened my email. There was an email from Brad. He had resigned. I guess I should not have been surprised. In the following 2 years, I made trips out there with Dale, and we'd see new handprints, and he said he always knew that they were there, even when we were kids. I said, "Why the hell didn't you say anything?" He said his dad and his grandpa had told him and Terry not to say anything. If you don't bother them, then they won't bother you. I said, "Even with the hunting and fishing and shooting?" He said he figured that they understood that we weren't trying to hurt them, and they just watched us from a distance, and they kind of liked kids, I guess. Maybe they thought we were funny or interesting, and every now and then they would leave their mark on the hand house. We never saw any tracks, and I always thought that was as odd as the handprints. We saw the handprints, but not the other. Maybe they always used the bridge. I am long since retired now and still have a hard time wrapping the professional side of me around this event. Since this all came together, I've actually wanted to lay eyes on one of these creatures, and maybe someday before I'm too old, they will give me that opportunity. And just for your information, the hand house is still there.